You're listening to School Leadership Reimagined, episode number 21.
Welcome to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast, where we rethink what's possible to transform your school. If you're tired of settling for small wins and incremental improvement, then stay tuned to discover powerful and practical strategies for getting every teacher in your school moving towards excellence. Now, here's your host, Robyn Jackson.
Hey builders, welcome to episode 21 of the School Leadership Reimagined podcast. I'm your host, Robyn Jackson, and today this is part 2 of a 2-part series on how to overcome the 6 sources of resistance. Now, we learned last time that if you really want to not only overcome resistance, but actually turn that resistance into, commitment and buy-in, then the first step is you need to understand the 6 sources of resistance and really what's actually behind, what's feeding each one. You see, people get stuck at one of these 6 layers or sources of resistance. And as long as they're stuck, they can't make the changes that you're asking them to make, whether that's an individual or an entire organization. But if you understand what layer of resistance you're dealing with, then you can speak directly to that layer of resistance and get everybody unstuck and on board and really moving towards big and meaningful goals. So also in part 1, we looked at the first 2 layers of resistance, which have to do with resistance to the problem that you're trying to solve. So the first layer was really about what do you do about people who won't even admit that there is a problem? People get stuck here either because they can't actually see the problem, or they do see the problem, but they're really afraid to admit to it because they fear that they're going to look bad or they're going to be blamed for the problem. And then the second layer of resistance is feeling that the problem is out of their hands. And this is what happens when, people will, they'll admit that there is a problem, but then they'll immediately follow up with, well, there's nothing we can do about it, or there's nothing I can do personally to solve that problem. And we talked about how you can get people unstuck there and moving towards your goals. So, by the way, if you haven't listened to part 1, you can go back and listen to that episode, and it's episode 20, and I'll make sure that I link to it in the show notes. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the other 4 layers of resistance, which are really about resistance to the solution. So you've gone through the first 2 layers. People now admit that there's a problem. They now feel that there is something that they can do about the problem. And now we're going to talk about resistance that's really about people pushing back because they don't agree with your solution, or because they're afraid to change, or they are afraid to make the change that you're asking them to make. And at the end of this episode, I'm also going to give you a really cool freebie, and you can download it at the end of this episode, and it's going to have all 6 layers of resistance in one place so that you can keep it as a handy cheat sheet and remind yourself when you encounter resistance, you can go back and say, which layer is this? And then that'll tell you how you begin to resolve it. Now, as I go through each of these layers of resistance, I'm going to explain what's behind each layer, and then I'll tell you exactly what you need to do at that particular layer to turn that specific kind of resistance into this really huge opportunity to get real buy-in from the person you're working with or from the people you're working with. Now, that way, when you hear an objection, you can actually pinpoint what layer of resistance it belongs to, and you'll know exactly how to respond to that objection and get that person on board without wasting a whole bunch of time arguing or getting sidetracked by stuff that really doesn't matter and, quite frankly, keeps you distracted from what you really need to talk about. Now, before we dive in, I want to invite you to Builders Lab 2019, which is happening January 28th through 30th, 2019. Now, here's why I love Builders Lab. All too often, you go to a conference and you hear some great speakers, you attend some really cool breakout sessions, you meet a lot of cool people, you get all fired up to make change in your building when you return. And then as soon as you walk into the building, your first day back, you get slammed with all the stuff that was waiting for you. And poof, there goes your fire. There goes your enthusiasm. And before long, you've forgotten, oh yeah, I went to that conference. It was really good. I should try some of that stuff. And nothing gets done. And there's a reason why that happens. It's because while you might have learned some really great things, you didn't stop and take what you learned and create an actual action plan for how you're going to implement it when you get home. And maybe you've done some sort of informal plan. We're going to do this, 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 and this, but then it doesn't take into account all the things that are waiting for you when you get back. Well, I'm not going to let that happen to you at Builder's Lab. You see, Builder's Lab is very, very practical, very hands-on, so that right away you start using what you've learned. I've had people learn something in a session in Builder's Lab, and then during the break, they go out, they check their email, they see that some fire is happening back at the school, and they immediately take what they learned in that last session. They use it to write an email to respond to that urgent email, and it actually handles the fire before it gets out of control. It's all done. So even while you're at Builder's Lab, the things that you're learning, you can use as you're corresponding with your school back home and immediately start to see some results. Plus, on the last day of Builder's Lab, we're going to spend the entire afternoon creating your personal 90-day plan. I'm going to take you step by step through the process so that you have a solid, airtight plan that you won't just be excited about, you'll also be ready to actually put it into place immediately as soon as you get back to school. And some people start putting their plan in place that afternoon. And not only that, I'm going to check on you after Builder's Lab is over to make sure that you stick with your plan. You see, because we keep Builder's Lab really, really small and intimate, you and I will have bonded over those 3 days that we spend together. And by the end, I'm going to be even more invested in your success than I already am. So if you really want to take action this year and you're already stuck, or you've got big goals for your school and you want to learn how to make sure that those big goals actually come to fruition, then won't you join me, please, at Builder's Lab 2019? Because I think that together we can actually work and develop something that will actually make your goals come true. So you can find more information and actually get tickets by going to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab. That's mindstepsinc.com/builders, BUILDERS-lab, LAB. And I'll make sure that I link to that in the show notes. Okay, let's dive in. We're on layer number 3. Now we're starting to talk, we've dealt with the problem, and now we're starting to talk about the solution. So layer number 3 is really about pushback that comes when people argue that the proposed solution can't possibly yield the desired results or outcomes that you're promising that it will yield. And this layer of resistance usually shows up when people agree on the problem, but they don't agree on the solution. So for instance, yes, everyone agrees that we need to raise test scores, but some people think that we need to do it through more rigorous instruction, while others think, no, differentiation is the answer. And still others think, no, what we need to do is we need to get students more motivated to take the test. And everybody's trying to convince everybody else that the other solutions are flawed and won't work, and their solution is better. And when people get here, I just need to warn you, they get really stubborn, and a lot of times they won't listen or hear anybody else out. And what's even worse is that when the arguments get more heated, people start to take things personally at this stage. They start getting emotional, and then they start digging their heels in even further. So, big obstacle, right? Well, there's also an opportunity, and here's the opportunity. When you meet resistance around the solution to the problem, what you need to do is you need to get everybody together, and before you discuss the solutions on the table, first you need to create a list of criteria for what would be a good solution. So, for instance, if you're trying to improve test scores, you might agree that the right solution has to actually produce significant and steady gains in student achievement without creating too much extra work for teachers or involving drill and kill. So if you can get everybody to agree around what will a good solution look like first, then you can talk about the solutions that people propose and weigh them against this criteria. So if you can't get agreement around which solution, first you need to get agreement around what makes a good solution. And that's going to help you set some really clear criteria. It's going to really clarify your goals. And then when people sit around and they're arguing, they can argue against that rubric, if you will. So the point is, that when you come together as a group, you first agree what a good solution looks like, and then you weigh everybody's solution against your criteria. And that's what's going to help you collectively determine which solution would be best. And by having a set of criteria that we all agree to, we actually mitigate the risk of the discussion becoming personal. It's not about you. It's not personal. Instead, you can have a practical and really logical discussion, and you can come to some consensus. And that actually builds coalition around the solution, because even if my solution doesn't get picked, because I've agreed on the criteria for the solution and I've agreed with the group, this is what makes a good solution. The solution that meets that criteria gets picked. I'm going to be more likely to buy into that solution because I agreed on that criteria. So this helps overcome the turf wars that start a lot of times around solutions and helps everybody come together around one solution. It's brilliant. So the next layer of resistance is actually related to this one, and that's the yes, but layer. And this is where people argue about your proposed solution, and they argue that, okay, all right, we've agreed on the solution, but there's some sort of negative effect that's going to result from this solution. So for instance, you may propose that teachers increase rigor, but then some teachers argue that more rigor will be too hard for students, and their students will give up after a while, or it'll become demotivating. Or they may worry that more rigor might be more work for them. Or they may argue that if you spend more time going in depth in their lessons, like rigor demands, that they won't be able to get through their entire curriculum. You get the point. This layer of resistance is where people agree that, yes, we have a problem, and yes, the problem needs solving. And they may even agree that rigor or whatever your solution is the right answer. But they worry that making a change like that is going to have some real negative consequences. And they're really scared about that. And sometimes in our haste to get buy-in quickly, we might try to address, one or two of the concerns that people raise and make little small adjustments to our plan. And then we're ready to move on. But that would be a mistake, because if you don't address each objection that's being raised at this stage, the solution will always feel like it's inadequate to people. Or worse, people might think your solution is actually harmful. There is no getting around this. You have to spend as much time and effort as it takes on this layer, or you will not get full buy-in. And that's one of the reasons why, even in the books that I write, I always build a yes, but section into most of the books that I write and into all of the workshops that I produce, because I've learned the hard way that if you don't deal with the yes, buts directly, then people are going to get stalled, or they're going to shut down altogether. Now, yes, buts can show up in a couple of different ways. Sometimes they show up because even though we've agreed that the solution is a good solution, well, people start to worry that they're going to have to give up something, or they're going to face a negative consequence or a negative side effect if they implement the solution. I mean, think about teachers who believe in differentiation, but, they worry that it's going to be more work for them, or teachers who believe in more rigorous instruction, but they worry that it's going to mean that they have to give up some of their favorite assignments because their favorite assignments aren't rigorous enough. So it's really, sometimes people produce yes, buts because they're really worried that, it's the right solution, but I'm really struggling because I'm going to have to give up something, or there's going to be some sort of negative side effect. So other times the yes, buts show up because people think that there is something blocking them from actually implementing the solution. So this is a little different. It's not, I'm worried about what I'm going to give up. It's really, I'm worried about, okay, this is the right solution, but there's something going on that's going on with me personally that might keep me from being good at the implementation. So a teacher might believe in differentiation, but they may feel like they can't implement it because they're missing a key resource. Or they might believe in rigor, but they feel that the mandatory test preparations for the state or for the state test actually siphon away all their time, and they leave little time to do work that's really more important and more meaningful and more rigorous. So sometimes people have yes, buts because they're afraid that they're going to have to give something up. But sometimes people have yes, buts because I believe in it, but they feel like there's a barrier or something that's getting in their way from being able to implement it. Here's the opportunity. The good news is that both types of yes, buts can be overcome, and they can be overcome by taking a simple step back and explaining why. And again, this is the real opportunity here. See, a lot of people get caught up on the details of the change that we're asking them to make, and they lose sight of why we're asking them to make the change to begin with. And so what happens then is that when they have to give up something, they are so focused on what they have to give up that they don't think about, I'm giving this thing up, but here's the bigger benefit that I'm going for. But when you explain the why, when they have to give up something, they can understand why they're giving it up, and they can focus on that something better that they're going to get in exchange. So when you explain the logic behind your decisions and the logic or the why behind the change that we're asking people to make, it's not only helpful in convincing people that the changes we're asking them to make sense, it also empowers them to find creative solutions to their obstacles. Because if people understand the why and they understand and they're really committed to the why, then they start getting really creative. Then they start seeing obstacles and they say, okay, here's an obstacle, but I'm focused on this bigger why, this bigger thing we're building. So they start getting creative and finding other ways around those obstacles. And if people understand why we want them to do something, and then here's the important part, what each step of the process is aimed to accomplish, and then why they need to do that before moving to the next step. If you can help people understand that, then you can trust people to make adjustments and to make things work for them and for their students, because they have clarity around the why, and they're in a much better position to improvise when they meet obstacles. I mean, can you see how empowering that can be? So rather than arguing with people about the details of the change, always anchor back to the outcome, the why. Why are we doing this? And why do we need to do this step? And why do we need to do this before we do the next step? Once people understand that, then you can trust them to improvise. All right. So far, we've dealt with resistance around whether we have a problem. We've dealt with resistance around whether we can solve the problem, whether the solution is a good solution. And then we've also dealt with the yes buts. The next two layers of resistance are really around resisting something that involves the implementation of the change. And so layer 5 is really about raising obstacles that will prevent implementation. And you run into this layer of resistance whenever people believe that the risk involved in making the change that you want them to make is just not worth it. And as long as someone believes that the risk is not worth it, we're in trouble. So, for instance, maybe your teachers believe that their lessons should be more rigorous, and they've even agreed to attempt a more rigorous unit planning process. But the moment you come into their classrooms for a formal observation that's tied to their evaluation, they revert to teaching the way they've always taught, because the risk of failing an observation, I'm saying failing in quotation marks, is just too big for teachers to take a chance to teach using the new rigorous teaching strategies that they've already worked on. So that's a huge obstacle. A lot of times you'll have a change, people believe in the change, but they're worried that if they make the change, the risk is going to be too big. They're going to pay too high a price. But there's also an opportunity here, because you can find ways to lower the risk and create safety nets. And when you do that, you can help people embrace the change. So, one of the things I teach at Builders Lab is I teach how to move people through a transformation process. So I teach a kind of 6-part transformation process that helps you implement big changes and make those big changes stick with people over time. And one of the things that I always stress is that as you're moving people through each stage, they're going to face a new risk, and that new risk is going to present a new problem. So I have this saying, new level, new devil. And what you have to do is you have to understand that each time people get deeper into the change, each time they move to a new level towards that big change you want them to make, they face a new obstacle, a new devil. And if you want people to not only buy into each new stage, but be successful at each new stage, you have to mitigate the risk and give them a safety net. So let me give an example of what I mean. So I was working with a school recently, and they were moving out of the explore stage. That's one of the 6 stages of the transformation process. They were moving out of the explore stage, where they work with teachers to identify the right problem and to solve and come together and agree on the right solution. And so in this school's case, they had agreed to really focus on more rigorous instruction and they were working through our rigorous staff development kits that for the semester in their PLCs to learn how to create rigorous units, to work together in their PLCs to create rigorous units, to give each other feedback on their rigorous units, and to implement more rigorous instruction in their classroom. So we have actually a staff development kit that is kind of a done-for-you professional development program that you can use in PLCs to help people learn how to improve the rigor of their lessons and work together to do that. So they were working through that in that semester in their PLCs. But naturally, because this was, all new to teachers, everybody was, a little nervous. Their big question was, look, you say that I should explore this process and figure out how to make it work for me. But, what happens if my administrator comes into my classroom while I'm doing all this, quote, exploring? And that's a good question, right? I mean, what happens when I am trying to figure out how to make this work for my teaching style and my students, and somebody comes in with a clipboard and a pen and they're taking notes on my instruction? And here's the answer. It's already baked into the transformation process. During the explore period, teachers are free to try the strategies that they're learning in their PLCs without penalty of evaluation. Now, the explore stage doesn't last forever. At some point they get to the evaluation stage, but, and here's the important part, by the time they get to the evaluation stage, they've already had plenty of time to practice in a non-evaluative environment. They've got non-evaluative feedback, and as a result, they've honed their craft so much so that when they are actually evaluated, they're ready for the evaluation. They've already known what they need to work on. They've already worked on it. So by the time somebody comes in with a clipboard, they are ready to go. Their teaching is solid. So you need to mitigate risk for folks to help them feel safe enough to actually implement the changes that they agree are the right changes to make, but they're worried about whether or not there's going to be too big of a penalty for making those changes. And that way, you not only get buy-in, you empower people to implement your solution successfully. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. No matter how much work you put into dealing with the layers of resistance, there are always going to be some people who still resist. And it's not because they object to the change or even because they object to the solution that you're asking them to implement. They might resist for a lot of other reasons, like, maybe they have a personality that makes them more prone to resistance, or maybe they feel pushed out of their comfort zone, or maybe they're uncomfortable with uncertainty, or maybe they experience social pressure from some of the more toxic teachers in your building, or maybe they don't like that your change is challenging some social norms in the building, or maybe, they may just be grappling with personal issues. Now, there's a reason why this layer of resistance is last, because, most of the time we jump here first. We start blaming our resistors. We start saying, well, he's just stuck in his ways, or she's just such a nasty, negative person. I'd expected her to resist this way. She never supports anything that we do. But in most cases, it's just not true. I mean, usually people don't resist you because they're just mean or crazy or nasty or, whatever label you're into using. Most of the time, people resist change because of all of the reasons that we've discussed so far. And that's actually good news, because that means that there is something that you can do about those reasons for resistance. And it's pretty straightforward. We've been talking about that. But there are sometimes when the heart of another person's resistance has nothing to do with the change that we're asking them to make. I mean, sometimes they're resisting because of something that's inside of them. And that doesn't mean that you go off and you write them off and say, well, he's just a mean person, or he's just so negative, I expected that from him. I mean, if you run into this layer of resistance, the best thing that I know how to do to overcome this type of resistance is to understand that person's will driver and to feed that person's will driver. So there's some real opportunity here if you choose to accept it. Now, I go into depth in episode 5 about will drivers. It's called How to Motivate Anybody, and it's actually one of our most popular episodes ever. So I encourage you to check out and learn how to overcome this layer of resistance and go to episode 5, and I'll make sure that I link to it in the show notes. But I will say this for now. just because you run up against internally motivated resistance, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook. No. You have a real opportunity here. And I find that most people who resist at this layer will tell you exactly how to overcome their resistance and exactly how you can get them on board if you just listen closely for their will drivers. So when they're coming to your office and they're complaining about what you're doing with this change, and normally you would just roll your eyes and just gird your loins and try to fight back. I don't want you to do that. I want you to just sit there and hear them out. And you're not hearing their complaints. You're hearing the why behind their complaints. What's that will driver? If you can hear that and you can start to address that, you can often overcome this layer of resistance. And then just feed their will drivers. Usually when you do that, you can get them motivated. So again, if you haven't listened to episode 5 yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. And I'll also make sure that I put the link in the show notes. So that's it. Those are the 6 layers or sources of resistance. And that's it. Don't forget that we have a free download that you can go ahead to schoolleadershipreimagined.com/episode 21. And there you will find the free download with all 6 layers of resistance listed, plus a few tips on what you need to be doing at each layer. Now, before we go, I want to leave you with one final caveat, and it's really important. You see, when we say that we want buy-in, we have to mean it. That means that once people buy in, they own a part of the change as well. Get it? Buy-in. That means ownership. People don't invest themselves in something that they don't feel that they own. It just doesn't happen. So you're going to have to share ownership here. I mean, really share ownership of all of our changes with everybody else. You just can't pay lip service to it. Of course, there's shared ownership. I believe in that in this building. It doesn't work like that if you don't actually live it out. We've got to set aside our egos, and we've got to learn to welcome inquiries, questions, objections from other people. And we have to encourage folks to ask questions, to speak their minds so we know what they're thinking. It also means that when we ask questions, we have to genuinely answer them, not just kind of, try to dismiss the question or get through it as quickly as possible. We have to genuinely consider what they're asking us. And that means that we may have to go back and clarify missing details that their questions raise. In addition, and this is really key to the whole thing, we have to evaluate their objections objectively. You can't just take everybody's objection personally and get your feelings hurt. You've got to keep an open mind. You might just find that at least some of their concerns actually hold water. And if we accept their reservations and we ask for their input on how to overcome them, we give them more ownership over the current decisions and future actions. So the more that we acknowledge their valid reservations and incorporate their suggestions into the change plan, the more they will own the change too. That's really important. A lot of times, and I'm probably going to do an episode about this, at some point, because I see a lot of people will say they want people to take ownership when really they want people to be better renters. Ownership means that I get to be a part of the decision making. Renters mean that I occupy a space, but you control the space. And if you want change to stick, if you want to get people fully invested in your change, they have to be owners. They have to be co-owners and co-creators. And that's why I love buildership. Bosses completely control and own everything. And leaders try to share ownership, but they tend to hold on to ownership of the important things and share ownership of the less important things. Builders invite people to be co-creators. Because the thing that you're building is more important than your ego. The thing that you're building is more powerful than anybody's individual concerns. Collectively, you come together. Everybody is a part of it. Everybody owns it. And here's the important thing. Everybody also has a responsibility and accountability for what it is that you're building. So if you really want to overcome resistance, you have to be sincere and desiring to help people take ownership of the changes you're trying to make. Otherwise, no matter what you do, you're always going to encounter resistance because people don't invest in something that they cannot own. All right, I'm off my soapbox for today, but I hope that you've begun to look at resistance to change a little differently as a result of the last 2 episodes, because instead of seeing it as an obstacle, what I'm hoping is that by peeling back the layers of resistance, you can find opportunities in those obstacles in each layer, and that will help you secure real, lasting buy-in and help everybody take ownership over the changes that you're trying to make. Now, one more thing before we go. I just want to remind you again about Builders Lab 2019, because if you're facing a lot of pushback right now, or you're worried that your culture is not ready for the changes that you want to make, or you're trying to embark upon a really big change, but you want to avoid as much pushback as possible, bring what you're working to Builders Lab, and I'm going to show you the exact steps that you need to take to overcome that pushback and get your change off the ground this year, not sometime in the future, this year. So remember, Builders Lab it's an intimate intensive where you can get coaching and support and personal attention. And so it's really the perfect place and time to step away from your busy school year for a few days and get some perspective and some support and some coaching to help you really implement the changes that you want to make in your school. And so what you do is you bring your biggest challenges to Builders Lab, and together we're going to come up with a solid plan to help you implement the changes that you're trying to make and get everybody on board and invested in those changes. So again, you can get your tickets for Builders Lab by going to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab. And I'll make sure I link to it in the show notes. Now, remember, this season is really all about turning your biggest obstacles into your biggest responsibilities. So next time, I'm going to talk about an obstacle that we almost never discuss, and that's burnout. And let me be honest with you, burnout is secretly killing our motivation. It's secretly sapping our energy, and it's keeping us from making the big difference that I believe that we were called to make. And here's the thing, burnout is a really sneaky little bugger. In fact, many of us are burned out right now, and we just don't even realize it. So next time, I'm going to share how to detect whether or not you are starting to experience a little burnout. And here's the cool thing. I'm going to show you how to turn that burnout into something that not only gives you tremendous clarity about what you're being called to do, about your own goals. I'm going to show you how to turn your burnout into one of the biggest opportunities that you will ever experience in your career. And I'm going to do that by getting really personal about my own struggle with burnout over the years and how I finally learned how to listen for and detect that burnout. And then how I began to leverage that burnout into some of the biggest, smartest, amazing career moves of my entire life. So join me next time where we're going to learn how to handle burnout like a builder.
Thank you for listening to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast. For show notes and free downloads, visit schoolleadershipreimagined.com. School Leadership Reimagined is brought to you by MindSteps, Inc., where we build master teachers.